On Tech News Today, a Cuban social network was created by the U.S. government to undermine the Cuban government. Google finally splits its stock. Europe finally gets strong net neutrality at long last. And Google wants to be your wireless carrier. All that and more coming up next.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Tech News Today is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Tech News Today for Thursday, April 3rd, 2014. This episode of Tech News Today is brought to you by Gazelle, the fast and simple way to sell your used gadgets. Find out what your used Apple and Android devices are worth at Gazelle.com. Welcome to Tech News Today. I'm Mike Elgin.
And I'm Jason Howell.
Tech News Today explores the big stories of the day in conversation with some of the world's best journalists. Our guest co-anchor today is Jillian Donfro, who writes for Business Insider. Welcome, Jillian.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you were on yesterday, and we were glad to have you back today as a guest co-anchor. You were an interview guest yesterday. I hope we weren't too rough on you.
No, I could handle it.
All right, let's get right into the news. A social network called Zunzuneo emerged in Cuba back in 2009 for users of the tightly controlled internet in that country, and then mysteriously vanished 2 years later. The Marxist one-party government there, ruled by the Castro brothers for 45 years, sounded paranoid when they called it a U.S.-controlled plot. But it turns out they were right. The whole thing was a U.S. government scheme to undermine the Castro brothers' grip on power. This is an outstanding and astonishing story, Jillian, because here's a, you see this a lot in popular culture and popular conversation, this idea that governments are secretly building social networks to sort of, mine and surveil the public and so on. And here's a case when, in fact, this entire social network was the product of the U.S. Agency for International Development of all agencies, the USAID it's called, and its purpose was to essentially build an audience of young people and then sort of foment dissent. They had these plans that they would organize flash mobs to go protest the government and do other things that would undermine the Cuban government. This is really quite a scoop, and I think it's has to be pointed out too that unlike almost every other scoop like this that we've had recently, this was not the result of the Edward Snowden revelations. He had nothing to do with it. This was good, old-fashioned investigative reporting by Reuters. Anyway, what do you think of this story? This is pretty astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if this had happened on April 1st, I would have thought it was a prank. And if I had seen this headline on The Onion, I probably would have been like, oh, that's hilarious. It's astonishing.
Absolutely is. And what's even more astonishing is the lengths. There are multiple dimensions to this story, but they went to huge lengths to hide the fact that this was the U.S. government behind it. They set up front companies in Spain and in the Cayman Islands to hide the money trail. And then they recruited CEOs without even telling them who was backing it. The people who joined the network thought it was an amazing breath of fresh air. There are interviews now circulating online of people who used it. And again, this went away 2 years after it launched, saying, wow, this is such a fantastic service. For the first time, we could really do social networking and stuff like that. And so everybody's kind of surprised everyone except Raul Castro and the Cuban government who correctly pegged this. Now, Jillian, we do, you and I both do a lot of reporting on technology. This was an astonishing act of investigative reporting, really impressive. The three reporters behind it, unfortunately, were unable to join us today, but they did a fantastic job. And one of them was a specialist in the U.S. AID. Another one was a specialist in Cuba, and another reporter was a specialist in sort of like this kind of money transfer type situations. But so just a few more details before we move on to the next story. But Zunzuneo grew and reached at least 40,000 subscribers. That's astonishing because Cuban government until very recently was absolutely tiny. The Cuban internet. To get on the internet in Cuba has and still is very expensive, very difficult. It's difficult even to get a PC in that country, and the average wage in Cuba is about $25 a month. So any sort of like involvement with the internet and with computers is very, very difficult. What do you think this is going to do? Is this, Jillian, do you think this is going to further erode the sort of trust in the U.S. government as an entity that goes after, that's doing these sort of secret, underhanded things that aren't as they appear? What do you think, how this is going to affect the already low esteem of the U.S. government?
I mean, yeah, I'd say that's pretty unquestionable. When you were talking about the different covert things that they did to cover up that this was a U.S. project, another one that stuck out to me was that they even had fake banner ads to kind of make it look like it was a commercial enterprise when it really wasn't. So yeah, I think it'll be another hard hit for the U.S. when we've already had a lot of hard hits in the recent months. So
exactly, most of the bad press has been directed at the NSA. In this case, USAID has been accused in the past of doing things kind of like this, of doing essentially espionage-like, or I don't know what you'd call this. I don't know if it's nation, but I don't know what this is, but doing this kind of activist, secret projects. They've always denied it, but here they've apparently been caught red-handed. So it's really, it's not just a hit against the U.S. government, but it's a hit against the U.S. government's efforts as a, this is it's supposed to be a kind of, it's an aid group. They're supposed to be out there feeding people and helping in disasters and things like that.
Yeah.
So this is really quite an astonishing story. When I saw it this morning and started reading about it, I've just kind of slack-jawed. It's just such a big surprise. Well, let's go to our next story and talk about what Google is up to. Google's long-awaited stock split, I think it's been awaited for about 2 years. It went into effect today, goes into effect today. Normally stories like this are pretty boring, stock splits, that kind of thing. But in this case, Google is not only splitting the stock, but changing the types of stocks issued to boost the power of the company's two founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and probably also a few other executives in the company. Critics call it a naked power grab. Supporters say it's just a smart move. Rolf Winkler is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal who's been covering this story, I think, for about 2 years. Welcome, Rolf. So can you tell us about these new share types that Google is issuing and what they mean for the company and its shareholders?
The new share types they're issuing. So let's back up. What does this mean? Google just split its stock. That's what happened today. So the price of the shares dropped in half, and they issued a new class of shares, Class C shares. Google has always had two classes of shares, Class A and Class B. The reason they have that, the Class B shares are the super voting ones, the ones that have 10 votes per share. Class A shares are the ones that have 1 vote per share. The Class B ones are the ones that Sergey Brin, Larry Page, and Eric Schmidt have, and that help them control, between the three of them, something like 63% of the company's votes. And the rest of us, the public, we have Class A shares out there. So now we're getting a new class of shares, and it's a little complicated, but that's the basics right there for you.
Now it sounds like at first glance that they're keeping all of the voting and super voting shares, the Class A and B shares, and then handing out the non-voting shares, the Class C shares, to the riffraff. But that's not the case, is it? The balance, just like the stocks are. When you do a stock split, nobody gains or loses money theoretically, or value. In this case, they're also distributing the non-voting shares equitably as well. Is that correct? Am I reading that right?
They are. So what's happening here, the new class of shares, the Class C shares, are designed to give the company a new currency, really, to make acquisitions with stock, and crucially to pay people with stock, to give people equity, to give people restricted stock, employees. But it's a way to give them shares, non-voting shares now, so that Larry Page, Sergey Brin, do not slowly lose their voting control. So if you kind of do the math here, what you think about is that over time they've been issuing lots of Class A shares since they went public, 4 stock comp, 4 acquisitions, and that slowly has diluted by giving out 1 vote at a time. The shares with 10 votes have lost some of their power. They've lost voting control. So to prevent them going below 50%, Google is now going to start issuing the C shares which have no votes.
I see.
So if you follow, that means the Class B shares now going forward will no longer be diluted.
Now, it's kind of a curious. There are 2 themes to this that I think may surprise some people reading your article. One of them is that they need to keep issuing these shares to raise money for acquisitions. That's one theme. The second theme is that ultimately they're afraid of their power being diluted. And I think that may surprise some readers for the following reasons. First of all, Google has a ton of cash, don't they? Aren't they one of these companies that just has billions and billions of dollars of cash already on hand that they could spend on acquisitions? And secondly, don't the founders and Eric Schmidt have almost total power? I mean, Larry Page is in addition to being a founder and one of the major stockholders, is also the CEO. Larry Schmidt was the CEO. Sergey Brin might be the next CEO. Who knows? But don't these guys have pretty much total power? And doesn't Google have plenty of money? Why? Can you explain these confusing elements?
Well, you're right. They do have a lot of cash, and they do often use that for acquisitions. Now, you're right. Right now, they do have control over the company, but if their voting stakes ever dropped below 50%, then theoretically, as that stake continues to drop lower and lower, you could have a scenario where, for instance, look at Apple with Carl Icahn. He's not happy with how Apple is spending its cash, so he can go make himself a nuisance at Apple. If you have a super voting control in a company, the way Mark Zuckerberg has at Facebook, the way the Google founders have at Google, then a guy like Carl Icahn can't come and bother you. Now, again, they do have control today, but if over time they continue to issue the Class A shares with one vote at a time, right, for equity, and these guys spend billions a year, not multiple, I don't have the number to hand, but they do spend a lot on restricted stock that they give out to employees. And that over time is going to reduce their control, and they just don't want to see that happen.
Yeah, and they probably, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jillian.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask a question. Do you think that we should be happy with the fact that the three founders want to keep so much of that power? Does it make sense? Is it good that a bet on Google is a bet in those three?
It's a good question. Some people would say yes. There are venture capitalists out there who argue that, look, if the founders have complete control of the company, they have a much longer term view, and they're going to make investments that will pay off down the road. And for somebody, and you're seeing that ambition, at least, with Facebook buying Oculus and WhatsApp, Google buying robots and getting into artificial intelligence, and the moonshots that Larry is investing in, Google X, across the company. These theoretically are very long-term projects, would take a long time to pay off. That short-term focused investors, more interested in return on their capital, they're not going to make those kind of long-term investments maybe that won't pay off in the short term, if ever, those kinds of venture capital type investments. Now, the flip side of that is they may not work. So when you buy Google shares, when you buy Facebook shares, you're trusting that these founders who have complete control, high stock prices, and a lot of cash to spend are going to spend it wisely.
Well, Rolf, I want to thank you for coming on Tech News Today and explaining this very interesting and unusual stock split and what it means for Google, everybody involved in Google, actually. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, guys.
You can find Rolf's work, of course, on the Wall Street Journal's website at WSJ.com, and you can find him on Twitter at Rolf Winkler. Rolf is spelled with an E at the end, by the way. In a sec, we're going to tell you what's happening in Europe for cell phone users. In other words, everybody in Europe. But first, I want to tell you about Gazelle. Gazelle is a company that will buy your used gadgets, and this is a good thing because the only thing better than gadgets is money to buy new gadgets. And they will give you that money with your old gadget that's, you're sitting around in a drawer or whatever. If you're watching the show, chances are you're pretty much probably a gadget fan. And, you're buying or would like to buy a new iPad or new Moto X or the new HTC One that Leo has been torturing everybody with around the Twit studios. And to pay for that, you can send in your old gadget to get the new gadget. Go to Gazelle.com. That's GAZELLE.com. Find the item. Tell them what condition it's in. If it's in great condition, they'll give you a little bit more. If it's not so great condition, they'll give you a little bit less, but they'll give you more than you probably think it's worth. It's usually surprising how much they're willing to pay for these old devices. And they'll pay you fast by check, PayPal, or if you use the Amazon gift card option, they'll pay you 5% more money for your device, which is a great option, and that's the one that I like to choose. And again, payment is fast. You get payment within a few days of your item being received, and it's risk-free. Once you lock in the offer, it's good for 30 days. Even if the value of the device goes down during that time, they'll still honor that price. Gazelle has paid more than $100 million to more than 700,000 customers. And again, free shipping, and most of these items qualify for a free box, which is great. It's very easy to use. You just put it in the box, put on the sticker, put it in the mail, and off it goes, and then you get your money. So find out what your Apple or Android device is worth. Take a minute, go to Gazelle.com and find out. Do it now, because your device may lose value the longer you wait. Well, the European Parliament passed a major set of telecom reforms, including strong net neutrality rules and laws to kill roaming fees within Europe. Maggie Reardon is a reporter for CNET who covers this topic, and we welcome you, Maggie.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, are you impressed with Europe's new net neutrality law?
Yeah, I mean, given the fact that what we had here in the U.S. was completely struck down and stripped just a couple of months ago, yeah, I mean, this is a big deal. You know, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because, you know, as many people are aware, the internet really doesn't seem to know borders. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see how this gets implemented in Europe when we don't have the same kinds of rules functioning here in the U.S.
So I'm, you know, first of all, very quickly, in addition to net neutrality, they also covered other topics of importance to smartphone users, including the kind of banishment of roaming fees within Europe. So if you get a smartphone or a cell phone anywhere in Europe, then you can't be charged roaming fees elsewhere in Europe if you travel around in Europe. So that'll be a kind of a nice thing for users, and not a nice thing for carriers who are kind of addicted to those roaming fees revenues. Now, I've been kind of following this and noticing that there's still a lot of confusion about the current state of net neutrality within the U.S., and this coverage of the European net neutrality law is kind of bringing it to the surface. For example, the Associated Press did a story on this and casually mentioned the status of the U.S. policy, and I'm going to quote that article. They wrote that European policy is now departing sharply with the route taken in the U.S., where a net neutrality law was struck down in January. Since then, Netflix has contracted with Comcast for preferential treatment of internet traffic bearing its film streams. Now, this seems to be, according to my understanding, flawed in three ways. First of all, it wasn't really a law that was struck down, was it? Wasn't it the FCC's own rules?
It's FCC regulation, which is not law. The FCC works at the behest of Congress, and under, you know, communications acts, they are given their power to be able to put in regulation. So the regulation was struck down. If there was a law, then everything would be hunky-dory.
And the second thing was, it wasn't, my understanding was that it wasn't struck down, as everybody seems to be saying. Didn't they just say that you can't apply net neutrality to carriers because they're not public utilities? They're not like the phone system or something like that. Not that they're not like that, but you don't call them that. The FCC itself didn't classify them as such. Yeah, I mean,
basically, for all intents and purposes, it was struck down. I mean, it basically lost, you know, the FCC, it was a technicality, a legal technicality, in terms of the way they formed their argument in supporting the regulation, but they are not able to enforce it because, you know, they based it on legal principles that the court found were invalid. So they have to go back, and actually that's what they're doing right now, is they're going back and they're trying to rewrite regulation that hopefully will work within the parameters of the law that will, you know, the most important thing that Chairman Tom Wheeler has said he wants to do is make sure that, you know, this idea of blocking traffic, which means you won't be able to access something like a Netflix at all, or a WhatsApp, that nobody can actually block any particular site or service. And also the anti-discrimination clause, which is you can't, you know, necessarily prefer one over the other. You know, you can't prefer, Comcast can't prefer its service over another provider's service because it competes with their own. And those are the two main principles. And that's what they've done in Europe. Now, I think, you know, you also pointed out that the AP, they did get some other things wrong in that story, because really the issue that's happening with Netflix and Comcast right now is not a net neutrality issue really at all. It has to do more with business arrangements and peering. And net neutrality has never tackled that issue at all, and I don't think that it will. And if you read statements that Chairman Wheeler has said, he's made that very clear that these are two separate issues. And I think the real question on that issue is, will the FCC start to look into peering arrangements, and is that a place for government to intercede, or do we let the market decide?
Yeah, it's a great point. And my understanding is that since this FCC rule was struck down in this interim period, and everybody knows they're going to come out with new rules, and there'll be a new set of rules for companies to play by. But in that interim period, there's this characterization of this situation as it's like a free-for-all, and companies are doing all kinds of different things to violate net neutrality. But essentially, I'm not aware of any single thing by any major company that is taking place because of what happened with the FCC's rules. Are you?
I'm not either. And, there have been very, very few instances ever where anybody has violated, so-called net neutrality. The same goes for, within Europe. I mean, it's really not been a problem for anybody. I think the issue is that everybody recognizes that the internet is changing, and that we're seeing more concentrated power of the companies that actually control the infrastructure, and what will they do with that power? And I think that's a valid question to ask. I think it's something that we need to keep an eye on. And, I think that it behooves everyone to have, rules of the road that everybody follows and knows and recognizes. I think, unfortunately, we're seeing all this discussion of business relationships and peering, which is a really complicated topic to understand. In fact, I've spent the past several weeks trying to figure out what the heck is actually going on with these arrangements. And it's really difficult, and it's difficult to explain to readers in a very basic way so that people understand and their eyes don't totally glaze over when you're talking about it. But it's important, but these are business arrangements. And right now, we have to figure out whether or not there's so much power in the hands of a Comcast or an AT&T or a Verizon, whether or not we need government to do something about that, to look at these business arrangements and see if there's anything kind of funny going on. And the problem right now is those contracts are not made public. So the government hasn't even looked at them at all. But, so I think this is something to sort of keep an eye on and see what happens.
Well, it is a difficult and complicated issue, and difficult to explain clearly to a general audience or even a technical audience. And you've done a great job on CNET and a great job here today. And I thank you for coming on Tech News Today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, you can find Maggie at cnet.com, of course, and on Twitter at Maggie_Reardon. Well, as expected, Microsoft unveiled Cortana yesterday, the Windows Phone virtual assistant feature, which will initially remain in beta and for the U.S. market only, competes with Apple's Siri and Google Now. Jillian, I was impressed by the demo of Cortana. What did you think?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty cool. I am into the fact of all the integration with other apps. One of the things that just personally really stuck out to me, which I don't know if this will be a big deal for most people, but I have Google Now currently, and I'm a sports fan, so when Syracuse was still in the running, basketball-wise, I would get updates on scores and everything, and I have heard that if you're going to get a similar thing through Cortana, the personal assistant will show emotion. So instead of Google Now just showing me the score to a Syracuse game, Cortana would know to have some sort of sassy comment if Syracuse lost, or show some sort of emotion. I thought that was pretty cool.
What if it supports another team? Wouldn't that be horrible? Now, you nailed one of what I think is the biggest features, which is the fact that it's going to be useful by other apps. In other words, you can create an app that will plug into Cortana, and that's fantastic. And I wish Google Now would do a lot more of that. I wish Siri could do a lot more of that as well. But that sounds like a killer feature. The other killer feature is this notebook feature, which essentially let's say you do install an app that supports Cortana and it does want to interact with you in some way, it asks you permission. It says, hey, do you want this app to be doing whatever it is it's going to do? And if you say yes, then that is logged in this notebook, which apparently is a user-friendly, plain English thing that tells you what Cortana knows and what it's capable of doing. And you can go in and edit it by hand and say, yes, I want this. No, I don't want that. And have a lot more control and visibility and transparency with your interaction with the app, which is entirely different from Google Now, which just seems like a black box throwing things at you, and you're like, wow, where'd you get that information? Although I'm exaggerating, there is a feature that allows you to go in and find out where the information comes from, but and you can control it to a certain extent through the sort of settings. But I love this notebook feature because it sounds like exactly what this kind of virtual assistant type thing should have, what all of them should have, that kind of clarity. Were there any other attributes to Cortana that you liked or didn't like?
It's not so much as a thing I didn't like, but in a lot of the coverage I've seen, it's kind of been called a Siri killer, which is setting the bar kind of low because, I mean, I really like Google Now, and I think it does a lot more, yep, there we go, than Siri does. And so I guess I'm excited about the features that it has. I don't know if it'll necessarily be a game changer for Windows phones, whether these capabilities that Cortana will have that Google Now doesn't have right now would be enough for me to say, oh, well, now I'll go buy a Windows phone.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. It's going to be hard for them to get people to get off their iPhones and Android phones and move to Windows Phone because of this feature, simply because Siri and Google Now are still both really good. And, of course, the proof is in the pudding. When Siri first came out, I happened to be an iPhone user at the time. I'm on the Moto X now, but back then I was an iPhone user. And I thought it was revolutionary, in part because I made an assumption that Apple would just continue to improve it and improve it and improve it. And it was actually best in the first couple of weeks, in my experience. And then it got worse. It started having server delays. It oftentimes didn't recognize things. It was problematic. And over the long period of time since Siri was unveiled with the iPhone 4S, it really hasn't gotten that much better. They haven't done a great job bringing in third-party applications like I think I expected, a lot of people expected. And so Cortana could turn out to be a real dog. It could end up being like this lousy thing that may have server problems. On the other hand, it could be super high performance. It could be better than Google Now or Siri. We just don't know. We've seen a great demo. Things tend to demo well in reality because, you know, on that day when they demoed it, Microsoft was pretty much the only user. So, you know, we'll see what happens when they roll it out at scale. Again, the Windows Phone market isn't as big as the iPhone market, so they won't be hitting the servers as hard as the Siri people will. But it's promising, and I thought it looked really cool, and I like the direction they're going into, and I hope they're influential on Google and Apple as well.
That's what I'm hoping too. That, I mean, if that's like the most important thing that comes from Cortana is improvements to Google Now, I'm psyched.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, you mentioned that it wouldn't get you to move to Windows Phone. I think this would be a nice feature, a really nice feature to add to Windows itself on the desktop and on mobile devices, so that, and really integrate it in a way that neither Google Now has done a good, Google hasn't done a good job. It just recently came to the Chrome browser. You know, that's okay, but I'd love to see this really built into as a core interface for Windows itself. I think that would help Windows a lot because Windows has a kind of a problem right now where it's losing mind share to OS X and also to, you know, cloud-based devices like, you know, Chromium and stuff like that. So I think this would help Microsoft a lot, and I hope they do it. And I believe they will, actually. I think they actually will build this into Windows as soon as they can. Well, Yahoo announced a new encryption, partly as a response to the Edward Snowden leaks. The company now encrypts traffic between its own data centers and also changed the default settings for the Yahoo homepage, so it's HTTPS, unless the user takes action to turn it off. And this is a kind of a partial thing. Curiously, a lot of their sites like Good Morning America on Yahoo, Yahoo News, Yahoo Sports, and Yahoo Finance won't have the HTTPS encryption by default because this interferes with ads. And this is curious because people who have chosen to enable encryption, you can still, so this is just simply opt in rather than opt out. Those who have opted in to the encryption haven't seen any changes to the way ads are displayed. So it's kind of a strange mystery as far as I'm concerned. But still, I think this is a good trend, and I think that the NSA's mass surveillance has had the opposite effect that they had hoped. They are being shut out of all of these consumer services. Well,
yeah. Oh, I just had, about the ad thing too, one of the questions that maybe you'll have an answer to, and maybe I just have to keep looking, is I read that Yahoo is trying to get an opt-out for those other homepages too, like the Good Morning America and the sports, that has to work with its ad partners to have them change their ads so that they'll be compatible with the encryption. And I'm just not sure why ads wouldn't want to do that. Like if it's a lot of effort for them, or if there are other negatives for them for not switching over. But it'll be interesting to see if there is a big shift and if all advertisers start making ads encryption compatible. I just think that's a really interesting, it could lead to some big changes in the ad world.
Yeah, I'm going to guess, and maybe the chat room has more insight on this as well, but I'm going to guess that it's simply the case that some ad servers and services assumed that the pages they'd be serving up to wouldn't be encrypted and haven't accounted for that. I know that that I often use an encryption service called ProXPN, and you know, most of the internet works fine, but every once in a while I'll hit a site that's just like, oh, we don't know what country you're coming in from, or we didn't really expect this, and so it could be something like that. But as I pointed out, it appears that most of the existing ads is probably one or two advertisers that are laggards and not really getting with the program, and I'm sure they will, because really the internet is going to encryption, and that's really what we need above all. We don't need encryption services that require a lot of knowledge and a lot of an active user or a power user. We need encryption that's just built in as the default for everything we use, so that the people who are using encryption are no longer suspicious simply for the fact that they're using encryption. So this is a good, part of a bigger trend and part of a good trend, in my opinion. Well, we have 3 follow-ups for you today. We told you back in February about Google's huge expansion of Google Fiber rollouts to up to 34 new cities. They're not actually expanding to 34 new cities. They're approaching 34 cities to try to get as many of them as possible, but it's still a big expansion. Google Fiber, of course, is Google's fiber infrastructure that the company claims is 100 times faster than your average broadband connection. Well, an exclusive by Amira Fradi on the Information this morning says Google's working on adding mobile wireless services to markets where Google Fiber exists. If Google goes forward with this idea, it's possible that a single monthly payment to Google would get you fast, really fast home internet connectivity, and also your mobile phone data and voice service. The company wouldn't build its own cell towers, but would instead act as a mobile virtual network operator using the services of an existing network, as a lot of carriers do. Jillian, this is a kind of an interesting and yet another confusing story. And again, this is early days for this. The sources, Amira Fradi's sources on this, are aware, have told him that they are talking to carriers about setting this up. They haven't apparently decided. They are not actually implementing this yet, but it appears like something they're interested in doing. I don't understand what the benefit would be if they're piggybacking on existing carriers. I don't know how they can improve service. They might be able to improve pricing, or maybe do a bundling deal of some kind, but I don't see how this, I'd love blistering fast mobile data connections. That would be fantastic, but it sounds like they're going to be piggybacking on existing carriers. What do you think of this? Would you want to get would you want to put all of your eggs in the Google basket?
I mean, there are a lot of people who don't even feel comfortable with the amount of eggs that they have in Google's basket right now. So I personally don't think I would have a problem with it, and maybe I would hop on board if there was some way to make it way faster. But I think there are a lot of people who are already suspicious about how much information Google has and how much they rely on Google and how much they use Google for everything, that probably would just shy away from this and not even consider it. I
think you're right. I'm not one of them. 100 times faster. Are you kidding? I'd jump in that basket so fast you wouldn't even see what hit you. Well, a website, in a second follow-up, a website promoting a new version of Windows for the Internet of Things appeared a couple of days ago. We told you about it yesterday. At the time, Microsoft hadn't announced what the site was promoting, and the site was quickly taken down. Well, yesterday, Microsoft announced it at its Build conference and brought the site back up. Awkwardly named Windows on the Internet of Things, the new version runs on the Raspberry Pi-like Galileo platform from Intel. Microsoft said the new version of Windows will be free and the site is windowsondevices.com if you want to check that out. Now, the third follow-up today is that we've been keeping you up to date on the Turkish government's block of Twitter within that country. One of several dramas unfolding there around this story is that Turkey's constitutional court ruled the ban illegal, but the government kept the block in place anyway, conveniently right through the upcoming election that they were trying to sort of control the information around. So that was an awkward thing. But Reuters reported, and Twitter has confirmed this morning, that the block has finally been lifted. Jillian, I hope the Turkish government, or the aspects or parts of the Turkish government that have implemented this ban on Twitter and also YouTube, and who are doing all kinds of weird things with Google DNS and other DNS servers that the public was using to try to get around the ban, I hope they don't get away with this. This is an awful thing. They ignored a constitutional court for several days. And then once they no longer really needed the ban because the election, it's too late for the election, then they went ahead and complied with the court. This sounds very, very undemocratic, and it's an awful precedent for how a government, especially a democracy, might interact with the internet and a country's potential control of the internet. Do you have any thoughts on this story in general?
Well, I do. I studied abroad in Turkey, actually. And one of the things that we talked a lot about was the state of democracy in Turkey. And I think it's, in a way, and bear with me, that what's happening right now in Turkey is good because it's sort of getting these issues out to a lot of people and letting people know that there's some serious democracy issues in Turkey who might otherwise never have learned about it. And hopefully it's spurring people who are interested to learn more about it, and spurring people to look more at these issues because it's really complicated. And
yeah, it is really complicated. And how long were you in Turkey?
4 months.
Okay, great. I was there for 3 months, I think, last year,
Oh, cool.
a little bit more than that. And as you know, there's a lot of censorship that's very widely accepted in Turkey.
Yeah.
Just of, porn sites and things like that are just routinely blocked. What happens is if you go to a site that's blocked, it gives you this message that says, oh, the Turkish government is blocking the site. It gives you this kind of like error page or something like that. It's very unsettling at first, and then you get used to it even as a visitor. But Turkey's an interesting case, and you talked about how you hope that this will bring it to the forefront of the political discussion. I'm certain it will. I hope it also serves as a lesson to governments who would like to do this kind of thing. I mean, you either have to go like China, go all in with censorship and internet control, just no holding back. You can't do what Turkey did and kind of do this half-hearted, block this, block that, but don't block all these other things, go in there and meddle. It just made them look so bad. And they were trying to suppress certain information. There were some recordings circulated by an opposition party that implicated the government and Erdogan, the prime minister, in a corruption scandal, and they tried to suppress it, but instead they got the whole world talking about it. So it was a huge problem for them. I hope that they get seriously spanked in the politics there in Turkey, and I hope that everybody learns that this is not the way to go forward, and you really can't control the internet, and when you try, it really hurts you badly, and you end up with the opposite effect that you were going for. Well, Jillian, I want to thank you for guest co-anchoring. Goes by fast, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It was fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks again for being on. Hope to have you again soon.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, here's how to follow Tech News Today, and we encourage you to do that. On Twitter, you can follow our Twitter account at Tech News Today TV. You can join our Google Plus community and also circle our page by searching for Tech News Today on Google Plus. And you can subscribe to our subreddit at technewstoday.reddit.com. We also want to hear from you. Send us an email at tnt@twit.tv or leave us a voicemail by calling 260-TNT-SHOW or both. You can both send an email and you can leave a voicemail. Also, don't miss our evening newscast, Tech News Tonight, at 4 p.m. Pacific tonight and every weeknight. My name is Mike Elgin. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow.